They built monuments to a moment that lasted less than 10 seconds, but no one in the galaxy could agree on what the human felt in the last one. The recording always began the same way, with the hollow groan of a dying ship drifting through vacuum, its hull temperature spiking past 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit as warning lights pulsed like a failing heartbeat. And somewhere inside that collapsing wreck, a single human moved through the smoke-stained corridors with a worn salvage rig and a stubborn refusal to leave anything behind. Ethan Cole had spent the last 6 years picking through the bones of forgotten ships, trading broken circuits for fuel and silence for survival. The kind of man no one remembered because he never asked to be. His boots scraped against warped metal as his visor flickered, oxygen readout blinking at 14%. Not great, but enough to finish one more sweep if he was quick. The air tasted like burnt copper and dust, each breath thinner than the last. But something on his scanner kept pulsing, a faint life signature buried deeper in the wreck. Probably a glitch, he muttered, though his feet were already moving toward it, because glitches didn't usually make his chest feel tight like that. The corridor narrowed, heat bleeding through his suit as the ship shifted around him, distant systems collapsing one by one. And then he saw it. A containment frame fused into the wall, half buried under debris, and inside it, a figure. At first, he thought it was just another piece of cargo, something expensive someone had tried to save. But then the figure moved, barely, a flicker like starlight underwater. He stepped closer, wiping condensation from his visor, and the image sharpened into something unmistakably alive. She was taller than he expected, even restrained, her skin a soft blue that seemed to catch what little light remained, glowing faintly as if the ship itself hadn't quite swallowed it yet. And for a second, Ethan just stood there. Not because he was afraid, but because something about her felt out of place, like she didn't belong in a graveyard like this. Her eyes opened slowly, sharp and aware despite everything, locking onto him with a clarity that cut through the haze. There was no relief in that gaze, no gratitude, only a cold, measuring distance, like she was trying to understand why he was even there. The translator in his helmet struggled, then caught, rendering her voice in clipped, precise English. "You're wasting time, human," she said, each word steady despite the faint tremor in her breath. "This vessel will not hold." Ethan glanced at the structural readouts cascading across his display, timer flashing red, integrity dropping by the second, and she wasn't wrong. He should have turned around right then, headed back to his shuttle, sealed the hatch, and left this wreck to finish what it started. That was the job. After all, salvage what you could, survive, repeat. But instead, he stepped closer, fingers brushing against the release mechanism of her restraints, feeling the heat through his gloves, hearing the distant echo of something giving way deeper in the ship. "Yeah," he said quietly, more to himself than to her. "I've heard worse odds." And somewhere above them, metal groaned again, louder this time, like the ship was reminding him exactly how little time he had left to decide who he was going to be. The release mechanism resisted at first, fused by heat and time, its edges glowing faintly as Ethan pressed his tool against it, feeling the vibration travel up his arm while the ship groaned around them like something alive and tired of holding itself together. His oxygen dropped to 11%, the number blinking harder now, more insistent. But his hands did not stop, steady in the way they always were when something needed fixing. Behind the glass of her containment frame, the alien watched him with that same sharp focus, her expression unreadable, as if she was studying a phenomenon rather than a person. "You do not understand," she said, voice low but precise. "If you free me, your survival probability decreases significantly." Ethan let out a quiet breath that fogged his visor again, eyes flicking briefly to the structural integrity warning flashing across his display, then back to the lock. "Yeah," he murmured. "I got that part." The final clamp snapped loose with a sharp, metallic crack, and the frame hissed open as internal pressure equalized. Heat spilled out, along with a faint shimmer of light from her skin, brighter now that the barrier was gone. She did not move immediately, her body still braced as if expecting a trap, her gaze never leaving his face. "Why?" she asked, the word carrying more weight this time. Less command and more confusion. Ethan reached in, gripping the edge of the frame to steady it, as another tremor ran through the ship, a deep shudder that sent dust drifting through the air like slow snow. "Because you are still breathing," he said simply, as if that answered everything. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the only sound the distant collapse of systems and the soft hiss of failing vents. Then she shifted, carefully, as if testing her own strength, one hand bracing against the edge before she pulled herself free. Up close, she was even more striking, her blue skin carrying faint lines of light that pulsed slowly, like a second heartbeat beneath the surface. She stood taller than him by a few inches, but there was a slight unsteadiness in the way she held herself, a sign that whatever had kept her contained had taken more than just her freedom. Ethan noticed it immediately, reaching instinctively for a stabilizer patch from his kit. She caught his wrist before he could apply it, her grip firm despite her condition, eyes narrowing. "Do not touch me," she said, not harsh, but absolute. Ethan froze for half a second, then slowly raised his free hand in a small gesture of surrender. "All right," he said, voice calm. "Your call." He stepped back just enough to give her space, even as another alarm cut through the air, louder this time, a countdown overlay appearing across his visor. Evacuation window. 2 minutes and 40 seconds. He turned his head toward the corridor leading back to his shuttle, calculating distance, obstacles, the time it would take to move 2 people instead of 1. The math was not complicated. It just was not favorable. "We need to move," he said, glancing back at her. She followed his gaze, then looked at him again, something shifting behind her eyes, something quieter. "You are choosing inefficiency," she observed. Ethan allowed himself a small, tired smile. "Happens more than you would think." Another tremor shook the deck, stronger now, and this time she did not argue. She stepped beside him, close enough that he could feel the faint warmth radiating from her skin through his suit. Together, they moved into the corridor, the light behind them fading as the broken frames sparked and died, and somewhere deep in the ship, something finally gave way, as if the entire structure had decided it would not wait much longer for either of them to decide what mattered most. The corridor stretched ahead like a throat closing in, walls bending slightly with each distant impact, the lighting flickering between dim amber and total darkness, and Ethan adjusted his pace instinctively, not too fast for her to fall behind, not too slow to lose the shrinking window they had left. His oxygen readout dropped to 9%, then 8, each number sharper than the last, but he kept his breathing steady, controlled, the way he had learned to do when panic would only waste what little he had. Beside him, Lyra moved with a quiet precision that did not match her earlier weakness, her steps light despite the instability underfoot, her eyes scanning everything with an awareness that felt almost unnatural. "Your vessel," she said suddenly, her voice calm despite the chaos around them. "It is within 600 feet, correct?" Ethan blinked, glancing at her, then back to the path ahead. "About that." "Yeah," he said, adjusting his direction slightly to avoid a collapsed section. "You got some kind of internal map I do not know about." She did not answer immediately, her gaze shifting toward a section of the wall where faint energy signatures flickered beneath the surface, almost invisible unless you knew what to look for. "I can feel the residual systems," she said finally, as if that explained everything. Ethan huffed a quiet breath, not quite a laugh. "Must be nice," he muttered, then slowed just enough to step over a warped support beam that had buckled into the walkway. The ship shuddered again, harder this time, a deep resonance that echoed through the metal and into his bones, and for a moment the gravity fluctuated, his boots lifting half an inch before slamming back down. Lyra steadied herself without touching him, her balance adjusting in a way that looked almost effortless, and Ethan noticed it even through the urgency, the difference between them, the way her body seemed to adapt instead of resist. "You are deteriorating," she observed, eyes flicking briefly to the blinking indicators on his suit. Ethan followed her gaze, then shrugged lightly. "Happens when you breathe more than the tank likes," he said, tone casual, though his chest already felt tighter, each inhale thinner than the last. They reached a junction where the corridor split. One path partially collapsed, the other still intact but longer, and Ethan paused for half a second, running the calculation again, distance versus time, stability versus speed. Before he could decide, Lyra stepped toward the longer route. This path maintains structural integrity for at least 1 minute longer, she said, her certainty leaving little room for argument. Ethan hesitated, then nodded once. Falling in beside her, "Lead the way," he said, and the words felt strange in his mouth, not because he was unused to following, but because he realized he trusted her assessment without knowing why. They moved together now, their steps falling into an unspoken rhythm. The silence between them no longer empty but charged with something quieter, something building. Another alarm cut through the air, sharper this time, and his visor flashed a new warning. Evacuation window, 1 minute and 20 seconds. Ethan exhaled slowly, the sound faint in his helmet, and for the first time since he found her, the math shifted from difficult to impossible. Lyra saw it in his expression before he said anything, her gaze narrowing slightly. "There is insufficient time for two," she said, not cold, but clear. Ethan did not answer right away, his eyes fixed on the faint outline of his shuttle's docking signal just beyond the next bend, a small blinking light in the distance, steady and indifferent. He swallowed once, throat dry, then forced his legs to keep moving. "Then we better not waste any more of it," he said quietly, and somewhere behind them, the ship let out a long, low groan, like it already knew how this decision was going to end. The blinking light of Ethan's shuttle grew clearer with every step, a steady white pulse cutting through the dim corridor like a promise that did not quite belong to both of them. And he felt his chest tighten again, not just from the thinning oxygen, but from the quiet certainty settling in his mind. The readout dropped to 6%, then flickered, the numbers lagging as if even the system knew it was running out of time to matter. Lyra slowed slightly beside him, her gaze shifting between the light ahead and the subtle tremor in his movements, her awareness sharpening in a way that felt almost surgical. "Your respiration is becoming irregular," she said, her tone still controlled, but carrying something new beneath it, something less detached. Ethan forced a breath in, slow and measured, though it felt like pulling air through a filter that no longer existed. "Yeah," he said, voice quieter now. "That tends to happen near the end of a bad day." The corridor narrowed further, heat pressing in from the walls as the ship's systems failed one by one, the air growing thinner, heavier, and yet somehow colder at the same time. They rounded the final bend, and the shuttle came fully into view, its hatch already open, its internal lights bright and stable in stark contrast to the dying vessel around them, a pocket of order, waiting just a few yards away. Ethan's steps slowed without him meaning to, his mind running the calculation again, not because he did not already know the answer, but because some part of him kept hoping it would change. One seat, one life support system calibrated for a single occupant, one launch window that would not wait. Lyra stopped beside him, her luminous skin reflecting the shuttle's light, her eyes fixed on the hatch, then shifting back to him with a precision that felt like she was measuring more than distance. "You knew," she said, not accusing, just stating it, "from the moment you released me." Ethan let out a small breath that barely registered in his suit, his shoulders rising and falling. With the effort, "I had a pretty good guess," he admitted, glancing at the shuttle, then back at her. For a moment, neither of them moved, the silence between them filled only by the distant, echoing strain of the ship coming apart around them. Lyra stepped closer, close enough now that the faint warmth of her presence cut through the cold creeping into his suit, her voice lower, more focused. "Then your actions are illogical," she said, but there was no certainty in it anymore, only a question she had not asked before. Ethan looked at her fully then, really looked, taking in the faint glow beneath her skin, the steadiness in her posture despite everything, the way her eyes held his without flinching, and something in his expression softened, not with regret, but with acceptance. "Yeah," he said quietly, "that tracks." Another alarm cut through the air, sharper, more urgent, and his visor flashed the final countdown. Evacuation window, 30 seconds. The number hung there, bright and undeniable, and this time he did not look away from it. Lyra followed his gaze, then back to his face, and whatever she saw there made her still for a fraction of a second longer than before. "There is still time for you to reach the shuttle," she said, the words precise, but slower now, as if she was choosing each one carefully. Ethan shook his head once, a small movement, almost tired. Not enough for both, he replied. And there was no hesitation left in his voice. The ship groaned again, louder than before, the sound rolling through the corridor like a final warning, and the light from the shuttle flickered for just an instant before stabilizing again, as if even it was aware of how close the moment had come. Ethan took a single step forward, closing the distance to the hatch, then stopped, his hand hovering near the edge, not entering, just resting there. And for the first time since they had met, he did not look at the exit. He looked at her, as if the decision was not about the shuttle at all, but about what he was about to do next. The countdown hit 20 seconds, and for the first time since stepping onto the ship, Ethan stopped thinking about the numbers, because there was nothing left to calculate. The answer had already settled somewhere deeper than logic, somewhere quiet and unmovable. Lyra watched him, her gaze sharper now, not searching the environment anymore, but studying him with an intensity that felt different, less like analysis and more like recognition. "Explain," she said, her voice lower, not commanding this time but asking, as if the answer mattered in a way she had not expected. Ethan let out a slow breath that barely filled his lungs, his visor dimming slightly at the edges, and he gave a small, almost apologetic shrug. "There is nothing complicated to explain," he said, his tone steady despite the strain. "You have a place to go, I do not." Her eyes narrowed at that, something flickering behind them, something that did not align with the certainty she carried before. "That is not accurate," she replied, taking a step closer. "You possess a vessel, resources, continued survival potential." Ethan shook his head once, a faint smile touching the corner of his mouth. "I mean after that," he said, glancing briefly at the open hatch, then back at her. "You matter out there, whether you like it or not." The words landed between them, heavier than anything that had been said so far, and for a moment, even the failing ship seemed to quiet around them. Lyra held his gaze, her expression shifting in small, almost imperceptible ways, the certainty in her posture giving way to something less defined, something unsettled. "You assume significance without sufficient data," she said, but the precision of her voice had softened, the edges no longer as sharp. Ethan exhaled again, slower this time, feeling the weight in his chest deepen, but he did not look away. "I do not need data for that," he replied quietly. Another warning tone cut through the air, louder, insistent, and his visor flashed 10 seconds remaining, the numbers large and unavoidable. Lyra turned her head slightly toward the shuttle, then back to him, and, for the first time, there was hesitation in her movement, a fraction of a second where she did not act. "If your assessment is incorrect," she said, the words coming more slowly now, "then your decision results in unnecessary loss." Ethan nodded once, accepting that without argument. "Would not be the first time," he said, his voice almost lighter than before, as if the weight had already been lifted from him. The ship groaned again, a deep, resonant sound that carried through the corridor, and the floor shifted just enough to remind them how little time remained. 5 seconds. Ethan reached out then, not abruptly, but with a calm certainty, his hand finding her arm, steady and firm. Her skin was warmer than he expected, the faint glow beneath it pulsing once at the contact, and she froze, not pulling away, just watching him. "Go," he said, the word simple, unforced, and for a moment, it seemed like she might resist, her posture tightening, her eyes searching his face for something he was not offering. Then the next tremor hit, sharper, and instinct took over. Ethan guided her forward, one step, then another, until she crossed the threshold into the shuttle. The interior lights reflected off her skin, brighter now, and she turned back immediately, hand rising as if to stop something that had already begun. "Ethan Cole," she said, his name precise on her tongue, as if she had memorized it in the span of a breath. He paused at the edge of the hatch, his hand already moving to the control panel on the exterior, and he met her gaze one last time, not with regret, not with doubt, but with something quieter, something final. "Just Ethan," he corrected gently, and before she could respond, his fingers pressed the command. The hatch began to seal between them, slow enough to see, too fast to change, and as the barrier closed, her hand lifted toward it, stopping just short of the surface, her expression no longer unreadable but unmistakably altered. The last thing she saw was him standing there, steady despite the failing ship. And the last thing he saw was the light from the shuttle reflecting in her eyes as it carried her away, the hatch sealed with a soft, final click that felt louder than anything the dying ship had made so far. And for a moment Ethan just stood there, his hand still resting against the metal, as if he could feel the shuttle on the other side, already separating from him inch by inch. The vibrations shifted beneath his boots as the docking clamps released, a subtle change in the rhythm of the ship that told him the only stable piece of it was leaving. His visor flickered again, oxygen reading dropping below 2% before the display dimmed entirely, as if it had decided numbers were no longer useful. He let his hand fall slowly, the weight of it heavier than before, and turned his head just enough to watch the small viewport on the side of the shuttle as it drifted away down the corridor, its thrusters firing in short, controlled bursts, carrying her toward a future he would never see. Inside, Lyra stood motionless, her gaze fixed on him through the reinforced glass, her expression no longer guarded or distant, but something quieter, something that had not existed when they met. She raised her hand again, this time pressing it flat against the interior of the viewport, not in command, not in resistance, but in acknowledgement. Ethan noticed it, even through the dimming edges of his vision, and for a second, he considered lifting his own hand in return, but instead he just gave the smallest nod, a motion so slight it might have been missed if she had not been watching him so closely. The shuttle accelerated, the distance widening, the light from its engines casting a brief, steady glow across the warped walls before it turned the corner and disappeared from sight. The corridor fell darker immediately, the last consistent source of light gone, leaving only the intermittent flicker of failing systems and the faint, cold illumination from distant stars bleeding through fractures in the hull. Ethan exhaled slowly, the breath shallow and thin, his chest rising with effort as the air in his suit grew stale, heavier, and yet somehow insufficient. He leaned back against the wall, the metal still warm beneath him, and tilted his head slightly, eyes following the faint lines of light tracing along the damaged ceiling. The ship groaned again, softer now, less like a warning and more like a long, drawn-out sigh, as if it too was reaching the end of what it could hold together. His thoughts did not race, did not panic. They simply slowed, settling into something calm and steady, the kind of quiet that only came when there was nothing left to decide. He thought briefly of the empty stretches of space he had crossed, the silent drift of broken ships, the routine that had filled his days, and it all felt distant now, like something that belonged to someone else. What remained was simpler, smaller, a single moment stretched just long enough to matter. Somewhere far beyond the hull, the shuttle would be clearing the debris field, its systems stabilizing, its course aligning with whatever signal or destination Lyra carried within her. He did not know where she would go, did not know what she would become, but the uncertainty did not bother him. If anything, it felt right that he would never know. His breathing slowed further, each inhale lighter than the last, and the edges of his vision softened into a dim blur where light and shadow blended together. He closed his eyes for a brief second, not out of fatigue, but out of something closer to relief, and when he opened them again, the stars beyond the fractured hull seemed brighter, sharper, as if the universe itself had leaned a little closer to watch. He let out one final, quiet breath, and in the stillness that followed, there was no fear, no regret, only the faint, steady echo of a choice that had already been made. The silence did not last as long as Ethan expected, not because something dramatic happened, but because the absence of sound slowly revealed everything else that had always been there. The faint hum of distant stars, the subtle shift of cooling metal, the quiet settling of a ship finally letting go of its purpose. His body remained where it was, leaning against the wall, but his awareness seemed to drift outward, no longer confined to the narrow corridor or the failing systems around him. Far beyond the fractured hull, the shuttle cut cleanly through the debris field, its thrusters stabilizing into a steady burn as it cleared the last fragments of the dying vessel, and inside, Lyra did not move from where she stood, her hand still pressed against the viewport long after Ethan had disappeared from view. The interior systems of the shuttle adjusted automatically, life support recalibrating, navigation aligning with distant signals, but she did not acknowledge any of it. Her focus fixed on the memory of a figure standing still while everything else fell away. Her breathing remained even, controlled, yet something within it had shifted, a subtle disruption in the rhythm she had known all her life. She lowered her hand slowly, the faint glow beneath her skin pulsing once, brighter than before, as if responding to something she could not yet define. The console beside her flickered, pulling her attention just enough to register the incoming data. Encrypted signals identifying her position, her status, her identity, and for a brief moment, she considered ignoring them, letting the silence stretch further, but habit, training, and something deeper guided her hand forward. The display recognized her immediately, systems unlocking, commands awaiting input, and the weight of who she was began to settle back into place around her, not as armor, but as something heavier. She initiated the transmission without speaking, her presence alone enough to trigger a cascade of responses across distances measured in light years. Far away, fleets adjusted their trajectories, command centers lit with activity, and a network of observers shifted their attention toward a single returning signal. Inside the shuttle, Lyra remained still, her gaze drifting back to the viewport, though there was nothing left to see. Only the distant scatter of stars and the fading outline of a place that no longer existed. Her fingers hovered above the console, then moved with deliberate precision, altering the course, not toward the nearest safe harbor, but toward something else, something that had not been part of the original path. The systems hesitated for a fraction of a second, recalculating, then complied. She did not explain the change, not to the ship, not to the unseen listeners now waiting for her arrival. Because the explanation did not fit into the structures they understood, what had happened was not strategy, not efficiency, not even survival. It was a choice she had witnessed, one that did not align with any model she had been taught, and yet it had reshaped something fundamental within her. The stars outside stretched into thin lines as the shuttle accelerated, the distance between her and that moment expanding with every second, but the impression it left did not fade with it. She closed her eyes briefly, not to rest, but to hold on to the clarity of it, the simplicity that had carried more weight than anything she had known. When she opened them again, her expression had changed, not dramatically, not in a way that could be measured easily, but enough that anyone who had known her before would have paused, uncertain of what they were seeing. The console continued to pulse with incoming transmissions, voices that would soon demand answers, decisions that would shape entire systems. And for the first time, Lyra did not respond immediately, because somewhere between the fading light of a dying ship and the steady glow of her own vessel, she had learned something that could not be translated into commands or orders, something that would follow her far beyond this moment. And long after the stars themselves had shifted, there would still be a question echoing through the space she now moved through, not about what had been lost, but about why it had mattered so much. The shuttle cut through the dark like a single deliberate thought, its engines humming with quiet precision as it crossed distances measured in millions of miles. And still Lyra had not spoken a single word. To the voices waiting for her on the other side of the void, the console pulsed steadily, layered signals overlapping, each one carrying authority, urgency, expectation, and for the first time in her life, she allowed them to wait. Outside the viewport, the stars no longer stretched but settled into fixed points again as the vessel exited its acceleration phase, the silence returning in a way that felt different now, not empty, but full of something she could not name. Her fingers hovered above the control interface, not uncertain, but deliberate, as if every motion now required more than instinct, more than training. She replayed the moment again without intending to, not as a recording, but as a sensation, the steady tone in Ethan's voice, the absence of hesitation, the way he had not tried to convince her, had not tried to be understood. Because you are still breathing. The words surfaced again, simple, inefficient, and yet they carried more weight than the entire network of decisions now waiting for her input. The console shifted, highlighting priority transmissions, identifiers cascading across the display, titles, ranks, entire fleets repositioning in anticipation of her return. She could feel the structure of her world reaching for her, ready to close around her again. to define her, to place her back into the system she had always navigated with precision. But something resisted, not in defiance, not in rebellion, but in quiet contradiction. She stepped closer to the viewport, the faint glow beneath her skin reflecting against the glass, and for a moment, she imagined the exact point in space where the ship had been, where the corridor had narrowed, where a human had chosen something that did not benefit him. The coordinates no longer mattered, the debris already dispersing, the physical trace of it fading. But the moment itself remained intact, untouched by distance. Her hand lifted again, stopping just short of the surface this time, not reaching for anything, simply marking the space where memory and reality no longer aligned. Behind her, the console chimed again, louder, more insistent, and this time she turned. The primary channel opened automatically. A projection forming in the air, a figure composed of light and authority, posture rigid, gaze immediate. "You are delayed," the voice said, not harsh, but firm, accustomed to being obeyed without question. Lyra met the projection's gaze without lowering her own, her expression calm, unchanged, yet something beneath it had shifted in a way the projection could not interpret. "I encountered an anomaly," she said, the words precise, but carrying a weight they did not normally hold. The projection paused, processing, recalibrating expectations. "Clarify." It responded. Lyra's eyes flickered briefly toward the viewport again, then back, and for a fraction of a second, there was a choice in what she would say next, a decision not of accuracy, but of meaning. "A human," she said finally, and the word did not sound the way it once had, stripped of dismissal, carrying something closer to recognition. The projection remained still, waiting for further data, for classification, for threat assessment, for strategic value, but Lyra did not continue immediately, because what she had witnessed did not fit into any of those categories. The silence stretched between them, not empty, but full of something new, something that would require more than a report to explain. And as the stars outside held steady, indifferent to the shift taking place within her, Lyra understood that whatever came next would not follow the path that had been set for her before, because somewhere in the space between survival and sacrifice, she had seen a truth that could not be unlearned, and the galaxy, whether it realized it or not, had already begun to change. Because of it, the projection remained suspended in the air between them, silent now, not because it lacked authority, but because it was waiting for clarity that did not arrive in the form it expected. And Lyra could feel the shift in its calculations, the subtle recalibration of a system that had always relied on predictable inputs. "Define anomaly," it said at last, its tone unchanged, but the delay itself marked a deviation. Lyra did not respond immediately, her gaze drifting once more toward the viewport where the stars held their distant positions, indifferent and endless. And for a brief moment she allowed herself to stand in that space between what she had been and what she was becoming. The memory did not fade with repetition. It sharpened, each detail more precise. The sound of failing systems, the steady cadence of a human voice that had not raised, had not demanded, had not justified. She turned back to the projection, her posture straight, composed, yet no longer entirely aligned with the expectations placed upon it. "The anomaly is not environmental," she said, her voice even. "It is behavioral." The projection processed this, its form flickering slightly as layers of analysis unfolded behind its steady exterior. "Specified behavioral deviation," it responded. Lyra paused again, not because she lacked the data, but because the translation itself felt insufficient, the frameworks available to her unable to contain what she had witnessed. "The human did not prioritize self-preservation," she said finally, each word deliberate. "He selected an outcome that reduced his survival probability to zero in order to ensure mine." The projection remained still, its silence longer this time, as if the statement itself required more than immediate classification. Context. It requested. Lyra held its gaze, her expression unchanged, though something beneath it had settled into certainty. "There was one viable escape," she said. "He transferred access to me without negotiation or condition." The projection's light shifted, a subtle indication of deeper processing, cross-referencing known human behavioral patterns, probability models, historical data. Such actions are statistically negligible, it stated. Insufficient to alter strategic assessment. Lyra felt the words register, not as opposition, but as limitation, a boundary defined by systems that had never accounted for what she had seen. Your assessment is incomplete, she replied, and this time there was no hesitation in her voice, no uncertainty. The projection's gaze sharpened, focusing more precisely on her. Clarify deviation in your conclusion, it said. Lyra stepped slightly closer to the console, the faint glow beneath her skin. Steady, no longer fluctuating, as if it had found a rhythm that matched something internal rather than external. The action was not efficient, she said. It did not produce immediate strategic gain, nor did it align with known survival optimization models. She paused, allowing the words to settle, then continued. Yet it altered the outcome of an entire system beyond its immediate scope. The projection remained silent, processing, its structure designed to evaluate outcomes, to measure impact across scales, and for the first time, it encountered a variable that did not fit cleanly into its parameters. Explain systemic alteration, it prompted. Lyra's eyes flickered briefly, not away, but inward, recalling the exact moment the decision had been made, the absence of calculation, the presence of something else entirely. I have modified course, she said, her voice steady. And I will initiate a change in engagement protocols regarding human contact. The projection's light intensified slightly, the implication registering immediately. On what authority? It asked. Lyra met its gaze without lowering her own, the answer forming not from rank, not from designation, but from something that had been given to her without demand. On observation, she said, and the simplicity of it carried more weight than any formal declaration. The silence that followed was not empty. It was transitional, a system encountering the edge of its own understanding, and beyond the shuttle, the stars remained unchanged. Yet somewhere within that unchanging expanse, a shift had already begun, not driven by force, not by command, but by a single moment that refused to be reduced to data. And as the projection continued to process what it had been given, Lyra understood that the question was no longer whether the galaxy would respond, but how long it would take before it realized it already had. The projection did not disappear, but it changed, its form becoming sharper, more defined, as if the system behind it had shifted from passive observation to active evaluation. And Lyra could feel the weight of that transition settle into the space between them. The silence stretched just long enough to suggest resistance, not from her, but from the structure that had governed everything she had known. Your directive exceeds standard authority parameters, the projection stated, its tone still controlled, but now carrying a density that had not been present before. Engagement protocols are determined by collective strategic consensus, not individual observation. Lyra did not move, her posture steady, her gaze unwavering, and for the first time, the words spoken to her felt distant, not incorrect, but incomplete. Then update the consensus, she replied, her voice calm, not forceful, but immovable in a way that did not rely on rank. The projection flickered again, processing, cross-referencing her identity, her position, the implications of her statement across multiple layers of command. Provide justification sufficient for systemic revision, it said. Lyra turned slightly, her attention shifting back to the viewport, the stars beyond remaining unchanged, silent witnesses to something far larger than either of them. You require data, she said, almost to herself. Then back to the projection. You require patterns, repetition, probability. She paused, the memory surfacing again, not as an image, but as a certainty. What I observed does not repeat often enough to be predicted, but it occurs consistently enough to alter outcomes when it does. The projection remained still, its light steady, waiting for elaboration. Lyra stepped closer to the console, her fingers brushing the interface, and a fragment of recorded data appeared, incomplete, distorted by failing systems, but intact enough to capture a single moment, a figure standing at the edge of a closing hatch, a voice speaking without urgency, without demand. She did not enhance it, did not clarify it beyond what it already was. This is the only record, she said. It is insufficient by your standards. The projection analyzed the fragment, its internal processes accelerating, searching for classification, for intent, for measurable gain. The subject's action results in termination of self. It concluded, no direct benefit to subject identified. Lyra nodded slightly. Correct. The projection paused again, longer this time, as if encountering a boundary it could not easily cross. Then the action lacked strategic value. It stated. Lyra's gaze sharpened, not in defiance, but in clarity. No, she said quietly. It lacks measurable value within your current parameters. The distinction settled between them, subtle but absolute. The projection's form shifted, recalibrating, attempting to integrate a variable that did not conform. Define revised parameter. It prompted. Lyra did not hesitate now, because the answer was no longer uncertain. Impact beyond immediate scope, she said. Influence on perception, behavior, and decision-making across species boundaries. The projection processed this, its structure adapting in real time, mapping potential outcomes, projecting scenarios. Such influence is intangible, it replied. Difficult to quantify. Lyra allowed a small breath, steady and controlled. That does not make it irrelevant. The words settled into the system, not as a command, but as a challenge to its existing framework. Beyond the shuttle, distant signals shifted, fleets adjusting not because they understood, but because they responded to her presence, her authority, her return. Inside the vessel, the air remained still, the lights steady, and for the first time, Lyra felt the full weight of what she was about to do, not as a responsibility imposed on her, but as a continuation of something that had already begun. Transmit revision, she said finally, her voice even. Initiate immediate review of human engagement classification. The projection held its form for a fraction of a second longer, then acknowledged, its light dimming slightly as the command propagated outward, carried across distances that would take years to cross in any physical sense, but only moments through the systems she now influenced. As the transmission spread, unnoticed by most, resisted by some, accepted by others, Lyra remained where she was, her gaze returning once more to the empty stretch of space behind her, and in that quiet, unchanging field of stars, the absence of one human life began to take shape as something far larger than presence, something that would not fade with time, but expand, quietly, steadily, until even the systems that could not measure it would be forced to recognize its effect. The transmission did not echo, it propagated, moving outward through channels that had carried orders for centuries, and for a brief span of time that could not be measured in seconds or miles, nothing appeared to change. Fleets continued their trajectories. Command centers processed their endless streams of data, and across the network, the revision Lyra initiated settled into place like a variable waiting to be acknowledged. She remained still as it happened, her gaze steady, not searching for confirmation, not expecting immediate response. Because she understood now that the effect of a single action was not always visible at the moment it occurred. The projection before her dimmed slightly, its function shifting from directive to observation, as if it too had recognized that something beyond its standard parameters had been set in motion. Revision acknowledged, it said, its tone neutral, but the delay before the statement carried meaning of its own. Lyra inclined her head slightly, not in deference, but in completion, as if a step had been taken that could not be reversed. Outside the shuttle, the stars remained unchanged, distant and silent. Yet somewhere within that vast stillness, a pattern had begun to shift. Far from her current position, a patrol vessel adjusted its scan parameters, flagging human vessels not as neutral variables, but as entities requiring contextual assessment. On another trajectory, a command algorithm hesitated for a fraction of a second before categorizing a human signal. The delay so brief, it went unnoticed, yet significant in its divergence from immediate classification. Across systems, small deviations accumulated, not enough to draw attention individually, but together forming the beginning of something larger. Lyra did not see these changes directly, but she understood them in the same way she had understood Ethan's decision, not through data, but through the certainty that once a pattern was introduced, it did not simply disappear. She moved away from the console slowly, her steps measured, the faint glow beneath her skin steady and calm, no longer fluctuating with uncertainty. The interior of the shuttle felt different now, not because anything had physically changed, but because the space it occupied in her mind had shifted. It was no longer just a vessel carrying her forward. It was the continuation of a moment that had not ended when the hatch closed. She paused near the viewport again, her reflection faint against the glass, layered over the distant stars, and, for a moment, she allowed herself to consider the scale of what had occurred. One human, one decision, one outcome that by all measurable standards should have remained insignificant, and yet it had altered her, and through her, it had begun to alter everything connected to her. She raised her hand slightly, not to touch the glass, but to hold it there, suspended in the space where memory and reality intersected. "Ethan," she said quietly, the name no longer precise and formal, but something softer, something that carried weight beyond identification. The word did not trigger any system response, did not initiate any protocol, but it remained in the air nonetheless, a marker of something that could not be processed or categorized. Behind her, the console continued its steady pulse, transmissions flowing, responses forming, the machinery of an entire system adapting in increments so small they could be overlooked, yet so consistent they would eventually define a new normal. Lyra lowered her hand, her posture straightening once more, but not returning to what it had been before. The difference was subtle, almost imperceptible, yet absolute. She turned away from the viewport, not because the memory had faded, but because it no longer needed to be held in place. It had already taken root. As the shuttle continued its path, carrying her toward a future that would demand decisions far greater in scale, she understood that what she carried with her was not a debt, not an obligation, but a perspective that could not be undone. And somewhere in the vast, quiet expanse behind her, where the remains of a ship had already begun to disperse into nothing, the absence of a single human life continued to expand outward, not as loss, but as influence, shaping outcomes in ways that would take time to be seen, but once seen, would never be forgotten. The first world that received her signal did not react with celebration. It reacted with silence, the kind that spreads through a command structure when something arrives that does not immediately fit. And as Lyra's shuttle slipped into the outer edge of controlled space, she could feel that silence waiting for her. The docking corridor extended ahead, illuminated in precise intervals, every surface polished, every system functioning exactly as it was designed to, a stark contrast to the fractured corridors she had left behind. And yet it felt less certain, less real in a way she could not fully articulate. Her vessel aligned automatically, clamps engaging with a soft, controlled resonance, and for a brief moment, everything held still, as if the entire structure was pausing before acknowledging her return. The hatch did not open immediately, the delay subtle but deliberate, and when it finally did, the air on the other side was cool, regulated, untouched by failure or urgency. Figures waited beyond it, their posture exact, their expressions composed, a formation built on hierarchy and expectation. Lyra stepped forward without hesitation, her movements measured, her presence alone enough to shift the atmosphere in the corridor, not through force, but through recognition of what she represented. No one spoke at first, not because they lacked instruction, but because something in her demeanor did not align with the version of her they had prepared for. The lead figure inclined their head slightly, a gesture of formal acknowledgement. "You have returned," they said, the statement simple, but weighted with implication. Lyra met their gaze, her expression steady, unchanged in structure, yet different in a way that was difficult to define. "Yes," she replied, her voice calm, carrying none of the urgency that had surrounded her departure. The silence that followed stretched just long enough to become noticeable, and within it, the system began to adjust, recalibrating its expectations in real time. "Your delay required assessment," the figure continued. "Your transmission has been received and is under review." Lyra inclined her head slightly, not in submission, but in acknowledgement of a process she had already set in motion. "It will require more than review," she said, her tone even, not confrontational, but absolute. The corridor remained still, the figures present absorbing the statement, processing its implications, and somewhere within the network that connected them all, her Earlier transmission continued to propagate, encountering resistance, acceptance, and confusion in equal measure. Lyra moved forward, the corridor opening before her, each step carrying her deeper into a structure. She had always navigated with precision, yet now approached with a different awareness. The walls reflected her faint glow, the steady rhythm beneath her skin no longer fluctuating, but constant, aligned with something internal rather than external. As she passed, subtle shifts occurred, glances exchanged, data updated, small deviations accumulating in ways that would not be recognized immediately, but would not disappear. She reached the central chamber without pause, the space vast, controlled, designed for decisions that shaped entire systems. And as the doors opened before her, the weight of expectation settled fully into place. Figures turned, attention focusing, the structure of authority aligning toward her, waiting for confirmation, for direction, for the continuation of what had always been. Lyra stepped into the center of it, her posture straight, her gaze steady, and for a brief moment, the memory of a single corridor, a single choice, existed alongside the vast complexity of everything before her. She did not push it aside, did not diminish it, because it had already proven its scale. Proceed, one of the figures said, the word carrying the full weight of the system behind it. Lyra allowed a single breath, slow and controlled, and in that moment, she understood that what she was about to say would not simply follow the structure that had been built around her. It would begin to reshape it. She lifted her gaze, meeting the collective attention of those who had always expected certainty from her, and spoke not as a continuation of what they knew, but as the beginning of something they did not yet understand, a shift that would not announce itself loudly, but would move through the system the same way a single decision had once moved through her. Quiet, undeniable, and impossible to reverse. The chamber did not erupt into motion when Lyra spoke. It stilled, the kind of stillness that comes when a system recognizes it is about to be redefined, and for a moment, no one interrupted her, not because they agreed, but because they did not yet understand enough to object. Her voice carried evenly through the space, not raised, not forceful, but anchored in something that did not require amplification. All current engagement protocols with humans will be suspended pending revision, she said, and the words settled into the structure like a fault line forming beneath a surface that had always appeared stable. The figures around her remained composed, but subtle shifts moved through them, micro-adjustments in posture, in attention, in the way they processed what had just been introduced. Provide justification, one of them said, the request. Expected, structured, but lacking the immediate certainty it would have carried before. Lyra did not hesitate, not because she had prepared an argument, but because she no longer needed one in the form they expected. A single human altered the trajectory of an outcome beyond measurable parameters, she said, her gaze steady. He chose to preserve another life without condition, without gain, and without expectation of recognition. The chamber absorbed this, not as data, but as something less defined, something that resisted immediate categorization. Isolated behavior does not define a species. Another voice responded, precise, controlled. Lyra inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the statement without conceding to it. No, she said, but it reveals what a species is capable of. The distinction settled into the space, subtle but irreversible. Silence followed, not empty, but active, each presence within the chamber recalibrating its position within a structure that had just shifted. Lyra allowed the silence to remain, did not fill it, because she understood now that the absence of immediate resolution was part of the process. Beyond the chamber, the transmission she had initiated continued to move, reaching systems that had never questioned their assumptions, introducing a variable that could not be ignored once acknowledged. Within the chamber, the first response came not as rejection, but as uncertainty, a rare state in a structure built on precision. What do you propose? The lead figure asked. And this time the question carried something different, not authority alone, but a recognition that the answer might not already exist within their framework. Lyra took a single step forward, the faint glow beneath her skin steady, her presence no longer defined solely by what she represented, but by what she had witnessed. We observe, she said. We engage without presumption, and we allow for outcomes that cannot be predicted. The words were simple, but their implication extended far beyond the chamber, beyond the system, into something that would take time to unfold. The figures before her did not respond immediately, and in that delay, the change began to root itself, not as an order imposed, but as a perspective introduced. Lyra turned her gaze slightly, not away from them, but beyond them, as if she could still see the empty stretch of space where everything had shifted. Somewhere within that distance, there was no marker, no signal, nothing to indicate that a moment had taken place that would ripple outward across entire civilizations. And yet, she carried it with her, not as memory alone, but as direction. There will be resistance, one of the figures said quietly, and this time it was not a challenge, but an acknowledgement. Lyra allowed a small breath, steady, unbroken. There always is, she replied, and there was no trace of doubt in it. The chamber remained still, but it was no longer the same stillness that had greeted her arrival. It was something else now, something in transition, far beyond the structure, beyond the fleets, beyond the reach of any immediate command. The influence of a single decision continued to expand, unseen but not unfelt, shaping perception in increments too small to track, yet too consistent to ignore. And in the quiet that followed her final words, Lyra understood that what had begun in a narrow corridor on a dying ship would not end with her, would not remain contained within a single system or a single species, because the truth she had witnessed did not belong to one moment. It belonged to all the moments that would come after. He was not recorded as a conqueror, not remembered for power or victory, but for something far less measurable and far more enduring, a choice made without witness, carried forward by those who would never meet him. And as the chamber slowly began to move, again, decisions forming, systems adjusting, the echo of that choice remained, quiet and steady, reminding a galaxy that strength was not always in survival, but in what one chose to give when survival